When we last left off, Merry and Blubbert, following the trail of Luffy and the Straw Hats, braved the calm waters of the East Blue, examining the first 101 chapters of One Piece, looking into the characters, world building, and themes of the saga. Many things were learned, and many a panel were thrown into the Hawk of Death treasure chest for future use. After a tumultuous journey up Reverse Mountain, Merry and Blubbert reached the peak safely and began their descent. Moments from officially entering the waters of the Grand Line, ready to start a new saga. Who will they meet on this journey? What will they discover? What new obstacles will they face? And what will they learn about the Grandeur of Alabasta? That doesn't bode well. Hang on, Merry, let's get you fixed up. Alright, welcome one and all to my new series covering the Alabasta saga of One Piece. I'd recommend watching the last series covering the East Blue, but if you haven't, here's some ground rules. Number 1, the concept of this series is that we read the series as if it were for the first time, seeing how Oda introduces readers to the characters, themes, and world building of the story, even if we're not consciously aware of it. Number 2, this is covering the manga only, no anime, minimal references to the SBS. Number 3, we default to the official translations, even though I know they weren't always the best in the early days. Number 4, I'll rarely reference future things unless I think it's too important to ignore. And number 5, if there is something I think is important to keep in mind for the future, but I don't want to spoil why it may be important in the future, I'll throw it in this handy-dandy chest so we can grab it to refer to later. Housekeeping out of the way, let's start where we left off, with Luffy and the crew rapidly descending Reverse Mountain and the Grand Line coming into view. Well, not much of the Grand Line, as it's hidden right behind Laboon, a whale that towers above the cliffs and lighthouses surrounding Reverse Mountain's exit. He's as big, if not larger, than the Neptunians that we saw in the Calm Belt last chapter. As the crew frantically try and figure out a way to avoid crashing into the whale, Luffy chooses violence. He fires the front-facing cannon of the Merry directly into the whale, the shockwave of which barely manages to stop the Going Merry from smashing to pieces, aside from the masthead snapping and nearly squashing Nami. The more sensible members of the crew quickly try to get clear of Laboon by rowing away as fast as they can, only for Luffy to feel slighted that his special seat was destroyed and once again chooses violence, deciding to punch Laboon in the eye. The rest of the crew has a completely reasonable reaction to this absolutely insane thing that Luffy has just done, but they don't have long before Laboon swallows them up, save for Luffy, who somehow manages to make his way on top of Laboon. Alright, what just happened? We're seeing an important theme being introduced, that's what, the theme of leadership. The East Blue was understanding what being a pirate was, what being a captain was, but now that Luffy has properly become a pirate in the eyes of the world government and has gathered himself a crew, he now has to learn what it means to lead them. Luffy is coming off a high. He has won victory after victory in the East Blue. His near-death and entanglement with Smoker somehow even just worked out for him in the end. Why would he think that his actions may have negative consequences? His punch first, ask questions later attitude has proven successful, so why wouldn't it work against a gargantuan whale? I would be remiss to say that Luffy's brashness isn't always called for. Oda did show off that his move for the cannon did minimize damage to the ship. However, even after his ship and crew have all been consumed, Luffy once again chooses violence, thinking hitting and stamping on the whale will somehow get them unswallowed. Luffy's journey navigating what it means for him to be a leader, to take responsibility for the lives and well-being of others, is going to span the entire series, or it has at least so far. But this journey really starts here, as Luffy is going to have to learn that his brash actions will have consequences for his crew, and he's going to have to learn that violence isn't always the answer to every single situation. Similarly, but also separate, is Luffy's current inability to grasp what he is capable of. It stems from that same place that his violent solution to every question comes from. Laboon is just so big, gargantuan, humongous. Did Luffy seriously think that his punch was going to do anything to it? Anything at all? We want our protagonists to be confident, but there's confidence and then there's this. Something to keep in mind, so I'll throw it in the chest for later. Thankfully, the series doesn't end here, and we see the crew alive and well inside the whale, and an island with a house within. As the person living within skewers a giant squid that has also ended up inside the whale, and Luffy discovers a hatch and series of tunnels inside the whale, we end our first chapter officially in the waters of the Grand Line. I always take extra time with the first chapter of each new story, especially because Oda frequently introduces what he wants to focus on in those stories in those chapters, at least in the earlier arcs when they were much tighter. Who knows what I'll do when I reach a behemoth like Dressrosa or Wano. So what else does Oda make sure to show us in this first chapter aside from highlighting Luffy's brashness and violence? First is, unfortunately, the damage to the Merry. We've had the whipstaff break going up Reverse Mountain, and now the masthead has snapped off as soon as they've reached the Grand Line. This little ship is already showing some wear and tear, and we've only just started the journey. We may not realize it just yet, but this is the start of a silently building tragedy which won't have ramifications until much later. Secondly, is that things are not always as they appear. This was frequently true for characters in the East Blue, but now we're seeing this happen with places, because Laboon is large enough to be considered both a character and a location in my book. He may look just like a giant whale, but he's got a hatch, tunnels, an island, and a house, all contained within, things that you certainly wouldn't expect a whale to have. I think this is Oda saying, hey, you're going to go to a wild variety of places in the Grand Line, but nothing is going to be as it first appears here. Everything is going to have depth, and something hidden, in this case literally, inside. The locations of the Grand Line won't be as simple as the towns and villages of the East Blue. Now let's cover the rest of the story, and we get introduced to new characters, starting with Mr. Nine and Miss Wednesday. I think this is a very interesting way to first introduce the antagonistic organization that defines this saga. Though Baroque Works itself is not mentioned by name, simply being called the organization. So, what do we find out about the organization from this first introduction? And then we'll talk about the two agents as individuals. The first thing we learn is that the organization is very unforgiving. Before Mr. Nine and Miss Wednesday even have the opportunity to report their failure to bring back Laboon, the Unluckies show up and ostensibly kill them via explosions simply because they have taken too long. With the arrival of the Unluckies, putting aside the fact that they are highly intelligent animals, the pair also introduce the naming structure of the organization's members, numbers for the Misters and days for the Misses, as just one pair wasn't enough to say it wasn't anything other than just a strange name. The other very interesting thing is that this organization doesn't appear to be a pirate organization, at least on the surface. Miss Wednesday calls the organization a company and talks about their work. Not particularly piratey language. Heck, they've even got a company motto, which also importantly is mystery, letting us know that this company is very secretive. Then, as for Mr. Nine and Miss Wednesday as individuals, they're kinda goofy. They give me major Team Rocket vibes, and the more I think about it objectively, they aren't really that villainous. Yes, they say they need to take out Crocus to get to Laboon, and yes, we all really love Laboon and his backstory pulls at the heartstrings, and obviously, in the real world, I do not endorse whaling, but those things aside, they're literally just trying to get food to feed their village. They're not trying to kill Laboon to sell his blubber or make a profit. It's not a killing out of greed, it almost seems out of desperation. So they're not irredeemably villainous, and when compared with the apparent unforgiving cruelty of the organization they work for, that sort of detail stands out. Aesthetically, it's hard to ignore that the two present as royalty, or at least the upper class. The attention to detail with how they almost always have their pinkies out is hilarious to me, which, while interesting in its own right, given revelations about Miss Wednesday that come next part, it's also worth noting for another reason. Why would a world with a world government have royalty? Yes, Mr. Nine is not actually a king, but this is the first instance of royalty being mentioned, aside from, I suppose, the title King of the Pirates. And it's important that Oda mentions it in the first arc of this saga, as we'll soon learn that this saga has a lot to do with royalty. Finally, the two of them sail off into the next arc with the Straw Hats, and I like this detail. First and foremost because it means that Vivi will have technically been aboard the Merry with the Straw Hats for the entirety of the Alabasta saga, all the way from the start of their journey leaving Reverse Mountain and up until they leave Alabasta, and that's just neat. Secondly, from a more meta perspective, in the East Blue, we had a non-Straw Hat member joining the crew between arcs only twice. First off was Kobe, and that was before Luffy had a crew, and really for him to be used to introduce the Marines, and also mark Kobe as a very important character. The only other time was Johnny and Yosaku connecting the Baradier to Arlong Park, and Arlong Park was more or less the climax of the East Blue. This time, the saga starts with two secondary, at least for the moment, characters joining the crew aboard the Merry right from the get-go. I may be reading too much into it, but I think it's a hint that this portion of the story will be all connected this time, unlike the relatively villain of the week style that the East Blue had. I think that's all I have to say about those two and their organization for now, so let's turn to Laboon. When talking about characters, I really try not to talk about much of the what, as in the literal actions they perform, or the surface level of the story. I don't want this series to devolve into a recount of events. Instead, I try to focus on what those actions mean, and the why behind those actions, both in a why did the character do this, and why did Oda write it this way. So while Laboon's backstory is tragic and heartrending, why is it being told? I can glean two reasons. First is timeline. 50 years ago is comfortably before the execution of Roger and the start of the Great Pirate Era. The start of the Great Pirate Era and the search of the One Piece is often given as the reason that pirates travel to the Grand Line. However, these pirates are going to the Grand Line before that motivation. Instead, their goal is to circumnavigate the world. Back with Gaimon, we learned that Roger was the only one to manage to rule the Grand Line, and Crocus says that the only group of pirates to reach the final island of the Grand Line was Roger and his crew. We can reasonably put two and two together at this point to say that circumnavigating the world via the Grand Line is the act of following the log pose to the final island of the Grand Line, with several asterisks after that statement. Remember, I do this analysis as if I'm a first-time reader. I know there are a lot of caveats to that statement that will be clarified over time. So, long before the One Piece became known to the world via Roger's declaration, pirates were still coming to the Grand Line with the goal of conquering it. That's important to have reinforced. The other important thing to have reinforced is the danger of the Grand Line. We've had a bit of a break from the idea that the Grand Line is a nightmarish place, but even though we've, in recent chapters, been having our perceptions of the Grand Line change to one where it is a place that people can pursue their dreams, it doesn't change the fact that it is still the pirate graveyard, somewhere that pirates flee in fear. Speaking of which, the pirates that have apparently abandoned Laboon, I think it's important that Oda gave them detail, even if it's only a little, namely their ship and Jolly Roger's bull design, and their captain's somewhat distinctive outfit. We also see them dancing, partying, and playing music, which gives the impression that they had a somewhat similar piratey outlook to Luffy, who thinks music and partying is an important part of being a pirate. Finally, we know they're from the West Blue, as that's where Laboon comes from, and he followed them to the Grand Line. One Piece is nothing if not an entire armory of Chekhov's guns, which is the principle that things should only be introduced if they have relevance later. So the fact that this crew has more detail than just generic pirate crew certainly makes me think that it should go in the chest to be retrieved at a later time. I think one other thing to point out is Laboon's denial. On first reading, it definitely comes off as Laboon not wanting to confront the truth of his situation, but knowing what we know now, is it belief? The same sort of belief that Luffy had in Nami when he was told that she betrayed him. Crocus says he has a reliable source that informed him that the pirates had fled, but would a friendly, partying pirate crew really do that to a whale they cared about? I guess we'll find out the truth. Eventually. Finally, it's time to talk about the man inside the whale, Crocus. Crocus is a bit of a mystery. Aside from perhaps the mayor of Luffy's hometown, he is the oldest character we've met in the story thus far, someone who has lived at, with a large asterisk next to the word, at, this lighthouse for 50 years. He seems to be pretty resilient despite his age, he takes a double cannon blast, and he seems to frequently swim in Laboon's stomach acid. I have no idea how much effort it took for him to literally carve passageways throughout Laboon's body, but I'm sure it couldn't have been very easy. He spears the Neptunian squid as well, and when he shows up, he certainly has the crew on guard. And then he opens his mouth. Crocus certainly doesn't strike me as any level of concerned when the crew show up at his island. As the lighthouse keeper at the entrance to the Grand Line, he's definitely seen many, many pirates. And as the contents lurking in Laboon's stomach implies, many have not been particularly fortunate. Yet he straight-faced says that he'll die if he were to clash with the Straw Hats. Then he plays it coy before telling Zoro way too many personal details. I can't say for absolute certain, but I think Crocus is messing with them. He may not be a fighter per se, but I reckon he could take them on if necessary. I think it's a nice detail that Luffy invites Crocus to his crew. I established last series that a key indicator if Luffy would want you on his crew is if you're willing to risk your life for your ideals, and he sees Crocus throwing himself in front of the cannon blast to protect Laboon, which neatly fits the bill. But Crocus is more than just some tough old guy looking after a giant whale. He knows things. He knows about the journey to become Pirate King. He knows about Laugh Tale. Old translations will use Raftel, but I'll use the modern clarified name. Now, the way that he describes Laugh Tale is not accurate to how we know it now. Or is it? All routes lead to one, and Laugh Tale is the final island of the Grand Line. It's just ambiguous enough that you could read it in a way that fits with modern knowledge we have, so final doesn't necessarily mean the last place that the log poses point towards, but in the context of what he's talking about, how log poses work, it certainly reads that way. But my question is this widely known information? The existence of the One Pieces, but where the One Piece is located might not be. Our crew certainly seem unaware. I also like that he only divulges this information after Luffy has proven his character to him. Though perhaps we shouldn't be surprised that he knows this information about Laugh Tale, as the final panel clues us in that Crocus seems to know Roger personally. More importantly, he wonders if Luffy and his crew are the pirates we've been waiting for all this time. Crocus mentions briefly that he did a stint on a pirate crew. Could it have been the crew of the Pirate King? But the Pirate King was waiting for someone, for a crew of pirates. Immediately this adds a level of depth to Roger's so far very limited actions. Did he reveal the One Piece to the world in order to draw this crew he was waiting for to the Grand Line? Has this got to do with his quote from Rogue Town, perhaps the part about the ebb and flow of the ages? What's this strange air around Luffy? The same thing that Smoker recognized in him that likened him to Roger? Or is it perhaps whatever force seems to be guiding and protecting Luffy? Who knows? Crocus, of course, serves one more very important purpose, but I'll get to that in a moment. Let's wrap up the characters. The rest of the crew doesn't have all that much to do in this short arc, other than reacting. The only thing really worth mentioning in my book is the fact that Nami is really not prepared for the Grand Line. Yes, she can read the weather and is an excellent navigator, but that only applies to the normal sea. The Grand Line is already proving to be a completely different beast, and she's going to have to learn on the fly, meaning that it's not going to be nearly as smooth sailing as it was back in the East. Luffy does have one more key moment, one that once again utilizes violence with mixed results. In order to stop Laboon from hurting himself against the Red Line, Luffy fights Laboon then declares him his rival, replicating the promise that Laboon made with his original crew to return in the future. He reinforces this promise by covering Laboon's scars with his crudely drawn Jolly Roger. I love double meanings like this. Of course, there is the stated reason of stopping Laboon from damaging himself so he doesn't damage the image, but then there's the symbolic reason. Laboon has been hurt dreadfully by his apparent abandonment. It's not just the physical scars, but the mental ones that he has to contend with. Luffy's new promise doesn't erase the pain and the scars of the abandonment, but it covers them with a bandage of hope. I did say mixed results though, so it's not all positive. In Luffy's haste, he severely damaged the Merry, snapping its mast. That makes 3 different kinds of injury immediately upon entering the Grand Line. Things are not looking good for the Merry if this sort of damage continues. Oh, and Usopp says he's not the ship's carpenter while repairing it, which I'm going to also throw that line in the chest. Alright, let's now summarize the world building and themes of this first arc, which are setting up this saga. Obviously, there's the start of the world building of the mysterious organization that I've mentioned. Then there's further expansion of the intelligence of animals. Laboon is probably about Richie or Chocho level of intelligence, but Mr. 13 and Miss Friday are a whole new high, taking orders and using tools as well as explosives. The slow buildup of Oda demonstrating how smart the various animals of the One Piece world are certainly has not stopped yet. Then there is the introduction of the potential existence of royalty existing in a world with a world government. But by far the most important bit of world building, and Crocus's very important unmentioned purpose, is the explanation of the mechanics of the Grand Line, specifically how navigation occurs and how log poses work. The fact that they have to stop at an island in order for their log pose to point towards the next one, and that the Straw Hats have to follow the log pose wherever it points if they want to continue their adventure. Crocus explains how these mechanics allow one to navigate the entirety of the Grand Line and reach its end, the quote-unquote final island, where the One Piece is most likely to be located. Though Crocus doesn't explicitly go that far, he's probably careful not to reveal too much like other old men that know a lot that we meet in the future, so he doesn't spoil the adventure. And yes, of course, we hear about Laugh Tale for the first time, fitting now that we've finally started the journey towards it. It's good to know the final destination, rather than aimlessly wandering the ocean without knowing exactly where we need to go. Our themes have been mostly mentioned: the increased focus on leadership, the quiet unfolding tragedy of the Merry's slow destruction, and making its glorious return from the East Blue. You know it, you love it, it's the Luffy Liberation Loop. Luffy has not stopped his liberating ways, and this time round, it's a mental liberation for Laboon. Luffy liberates Laboon from his anguish from being abandoned by his old crew and gives him hope for the future and a new purpose, relieving him from causing himself harm. And with a couple of guests, a final goal, and newfound knowledge, Luffy and the crew sail forth, properly beginning their new journey on the Grand Line, unknowingly beginning their journey towards Alabasta. Thank you so much for watching the start of this new series. I'm not 100% sure how long it will go for, but I'll be releasing a new part every 2 weeks with maybe a break or two thrown in. So if you don't want to miss it, make sure that you subscribe. I'm very excited to be continuing on with this series, but I'm always looking to improve, and if you've caught anything that I may have missed in covering Laboon's story, let me know in the comments, and I may mention it in a future part. How do you like the new look, the new expressions and all that? I think the Merry looks a bit cuter now. Either way, I hope you enjoyed it, and I'll see you in 2 weeks' time, and remember, it's not I attempt new things, it's we attempt new things. Thank you for watching, and I hope you have a fruitful day.